Let's cross live now to Kevork Almassian, a Syrian-Armenian political commentator joining us here on RT International. Great to see you today. What might be behind Russia's decision, do you think, to recognise the independence of the republics Lugansk and Donetsk? Do you think it fundamentally changes the situation?
Thank you very much for having me on RT, and I hope I won't be cancelled soon for being on a Russian misinformation outlet, as the European outlets now are calling RT. Actually, there is a consistent attempt to take the Ukrainian crisis out of context. There are pundits, journalists, and even Western officials are trying to say that the conflict started now. It's in 2020 or in 2021. However, we have to go back at least 7 years or 8 years back, when the US and the EU, they orchestrated a coup d'etat in Kiev, and they confessed it that they spent over $5 billion in order to remove the legitimate government there, and they installed a puppet government in Kiev, and they turned the country into a satellite state, a NATO satellite state. It's true that Ukraine is not yet a NATO member, theoretically. However, practically, it's under a heavy influence of NATO. And there are, the NGOs are spawning there, the net NGOs, the US aid NGOs, NGOs affiliated to George Soros, and they are creating politicians and civil society activists in order to spread anti-Russian sentiments. And this started from 2014. And these anti-Russian sentiments, in order to keep Russia separated from its sphere of influence, and especially from the Eurasia region, right? Because Brzezinski believes that if Russia has an easy access to the Eurasian area, it will revive its superpower character in the global scene. So the rise of these anti-Russian sentiments has also led to the rise of neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine. And these groups have been committing crimes and war crimes against either ethnic Russians or even Ukrainians who speak Russian.
Well, the reports of the crimes being committed there have been ultimately done with what have been Western weapons being funneled into Ukraine. So this is also another concern. I think you raise a very good point. But I wanted to ask you, while I still have you on here, Syria is throwing its hat into the ring for an opinion on this. Syria is saying it supports Russia's recognition of the Donbass. Why is Syria expressing this, do you think?
First of all, I just want to say, so after this anti-Russian sentiments, it's very natural development that Putin recognized Donetsk and Lugansk as independent states in order to secure these areas and the people living there. However, when it comes to Syria, Syria has witnessed a similar campaign by the Western governments, an anti-regime change war and the propaganda campaign against Syria. However, Syria also perceives the war in Syria doesn't perceive the war in Syria as isolated from the war in Ukraine, because Syria sees that there is a struggle of power nowadays, and especially between Russia and the United States, and there are two poles are trying to compete on international leverage, and therefore Syria sees itself as a part of this struggle of power against the United States, against the NATO regime change project. And therefore, it's a very, in my opinion, natural also thing from Syria to recognize the Donetsk and Donbass. And today, the Syrian Presidency posted a statement saying that President Bashar Assad received a parliamentary delegation in December 2021 and expressed his willingness to recognize Donetsk and Lugansk and cooperate with them on an economic level. Therefore, Syria's recognition, in my opinion, is just, it comes in the context of this struggle of power between Russia and the United States, and Syria chose its position quite clearly in this conflict. And what we see nowadays underground in Syria, for example, all this talk about Russia is encouraging separatism in eastern Ukraine. While we speak, the United States and its allies in Syria, they occupy 1/4 of the country, and they illegally, of course, without an invitation from the Syrian government, and they are encouraging separatists in the eastern shores of the Euphrates to create their own state. So all this hypocrisy and double standards from the West or Western officials is not surprising. But in my opinion, they were caught in surprise. With
you think they were caught in surprise? I think you've brought up some interesting comparisons there as well, Kevork, but also in certain realms around the world. I think Putin voiced this in the past 24 hours. There are concerns of history repeating itself. Kevork Almassian, a Syrian-Armenian political commentator, joining us live here on RT International. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.